Well, let's talk about building talent. So, Hannah Kain is the president and CEO of ALOM, and as I talked earlier, I met her on an airplane. She was coming back from Ford, and I was pretty tired, and I engaged her with, key supplier relationships and demand planning. And one of the things that I have learned over the last 5 to 7 years in talking to her is talent, and she's a firecracker. I just love what she does in terms of building talent, and she also is very active in the industry. She's a strong voice at the NAM group, which is really focused on how do we influence government regulation, how do we build within manufacturing the right talent. She's also very active in the National Association of Manufacturers, and love the fact that she is a member and a leader of How Women Lead in Silicon Valley. Now let's just say that again, How Women Lead in Silicon Valley. Go, Hannah Kain. And she also is on the advisory council of Heritage Bank of Commerce. And one of the interesting things that, I really love about her story, and I did a podcast with her, is during the COVID period, there was this real issue with her organization about how many kits to put together for COVID. If you remember, this whole area around testing and kits, her company is a contract manufacturer. They put together kits, and she was really struggling to get the right signal to put those together. And I think she had a lot of leadership to be able to drive real difference in making sure that we were safe during the COVID period. So with that, I want to punch out and bring her to the stage. You guys ready? Okay. Welcome, Hannah.
Yes, hello. My name is Hannah Kain, and I'm really honored to be here today and excited to be with all of you. The discussions I've heard have been very lively and interesting, and I hope I can add to those discussions here over the next half hour and then take questions and be with you. And I apologize to you who are on site in Washington, D.C. that I could not be there. I am in Silicon Valley right now and speaking to you from my home office. And it's a good day in California because we've got power. Now, I want to talk to you about the supply chain staffing and talent crisis. Before I get going, I want to say I will take questions at the end, but the number one question I get is, where's your funny accent from? My funny accent and my brief personal story is, I started out in Denmark. I was born in the town of Hans Christian Andersen, the fairy tale author. I leave him to tell fairy tales, and I deal with reality. So in 1990, I bought a one-way ticket to the US. In 94, I ended up in Silicon Valley. In 97, I started my company ALOM that I will tell you a little bit about in a moment. So let's get going on the slides, and again, really excited to be here with you today. So yes, we have a talent crisis, and we've written a lot about it. We've read a lot about it, and the talent crisis go on different levels. But I want to take a little bit of a different tack first, and look at some trends. Because reality is that this is not a new problem. This is not a problem that ought to surprise us. This is a problem we all knew and could be prepared for. And just like with everything else was surfacing during the pandemic, it was totally predictable. It was something that we knew would happen, just like the port crisis, just like a lot of the infrastructure crisis, just like the lack of collaboration in the supply chain. We knew that the talent crisis was going to happen. So, and I apologize for this fuzzy graph. This is from this week. This is from the National Association of Manufacturers, and this is a US-only graph. And it shows here the number of applicants per job opening. And so you see there's a huge spike in just when COVID hit, right? And a lot of companies closed down, and especially restaurants and other service industries. But when you look at the trend line, it's pretty clear. We are in trouble. So again, it's not a new thing, even when we look at it just from a number perspectives. In fact, if we look at it seen from a global perspective, it's across the board globally. There's one exception, one company that has got plenty of staff, and no, it's not China, it's India. So you know, this is for us who are in supply chain. It's a question of demand and supply, and it's a very simple equation. What we are seeing here in this graph is, well, you know, the crisis should more than double in 2030. So it's not like the trend line now is going to flatten significantly. No, this is going to continue to happen. And this is the new reality that we all need to deal with. So we can look at the demographics, we can look at our own staff, we can look at what everybody is thinking. It's a numbers game that really impacts us. There are also a number of other factors that's important here, such as how we think about work, and I'll get to that in a minute. So as I said, I'm really excited about being here today. I was asked to talk a little bit about how I and the company that I have the privilege of leading made it through the pandemic, and how we are looking at talent, the talent situation going into 2030. And that's what I'm going to do. Just really briefly about the company that we're talking about. That's ALOM. We are in supply chain. We are very passionate about supply chain. And we are working across the globe. We have founded and headquartered in Silicon Valley, and work out of 19 locations globally. We are really outsourced supply chain. So we are the doers. We have plants, as you can see, warehouses, etc. We are in 4 different verticals. So life sciences, technology, highly regulated industries, and automotive. And we work mainly with Fortune 100 and mid-sized companies, where we are doing everything from the planning procurement, all the way to the end user and back again. Of course, we, like everybody else who's doing have plants and facilities, we have hourly workers, we have people who had to show up during the pandemic, lots of learnings from the pandemic, but also lots of thoughts about how we move forward. So during the pandemic, we actually had to ramp pretty dramatically. We shipped COVID test kits. So you saw that the medical is one of the segments where we are very active. And in the medical industry, we have been specifically doing test kits since 2006. So we are one of the people with strong domain expertise in test kits, and consequently, we took this opportunity to help out with the test kits crisis in 2020 and 21 and 22. And so you saw we were shipping a lot of test kits in 21, and it was a big privilege, but it was also a challenge, right? Because while the supply of staff really tightened, we had to expand, and we had to expand throughout the facility, not just hourly workers, but just throughout everything. So we expanded also our products, and we really ran very tight on-time shipping, as you can see, even though we were in a crisis situation. What I want to talk about today is a little bit about the tools we use to do that. So we are all facing that uncertainty all the time. If there's one thing we learned through the pandemic is we are living in an uncertain world. We know that there are possibly smooth sailing ahead, but that could also be the volatility that we've seen, the uncertainty, things we need to react to. And so this is across the board. I mean, we're talking about the economy potentially going south. We're talking about business, the business environment being challenged. We are specifically in supply chain talking about a lot of challenges. I won't go into them because it would be very depressing to talk about here at the end, but we have unprecedented uncertainty and therefore also actually unprecedented opportunities for everybody who wants to make a career in supply chain. So we need to think about what's a fad, what's a trend, what are some of the changes we haven't even seen yet, and which actions and changes and course adjustments are really needed. So those are some of the things we need to think about as we are planning our staffing. So I said I was from Denmark. One of the famous people from Denmark is Niels Bohr, a nuclear physicist, and he said an expert is a person who has made all the mistakes that can be made in a very narrow field. And I think it's such a fun quote because it looks at being an expert in an untraditional way. And you wouldn't be at this conference if you didn't like that type of thing where you look at the things in an untraditional way. But I'm also showing it because I've got a lot of humility towards this topic, because no one has all the answers. And the future is uncertain. And I certainly also make my share of errors. So I'm going to share some of the successes that we've had, but please understand that we also have made a lot of errors, and also understand that my answers may not work for you. Culture and leadership is one of the most personal things that you can imagine. It needs to come from the heart, and it needs to be deep felt. And I think somebody's making jokes about authenticity and sincerity, and say if you can fake it, you can make it anywhere. But reality is you cannot fake those type of things. It needs to come from yourself. So in the end, the talent strategy that one needs to apply needs to be aligned with the overall strategy for a company or for a group. So we all need to understand how is the ecosystem that we are hiring for. And the mistake most people make is they hire for the existing ecosystem. They don't hire for the future ecosystem. So let's look at what I mean when I say ecosystem. So there are a couple of ecosystems that I really want you to think very deeply about when you're thinking about, okay, how should my future staffing look? So one thing we learned, and we learned it a deep lesson, is that there is in supply chain, when you're in supply chain, there needs to be a certain level of adjustment to new realities. So you have that entire responsiveness, agility, change management, thinking, really important, right? Things change around us and we need to react to it. And what we learned through the pandemic was it's not just the long-term changes. It's not the willingness to install a system that will work out in the future. It's also here and now. Now, the other thing that we know, and this is a real tough thing, right, is that when you're in operations, typically your personality is, I have found out how things are done. This is how we have always done them. And this is how we are going to continue to do them. And so that level of consistency is something many people hired for in the past. And now we are taking these people who are feeling very strongly about the way we used to do things. And we've always done things, and it's worked for us. And we're telling them to change, and sometimes change on a dime. And it doesn't necessarily work. It doesn't work for them. They have pulled the emergency brake. We are thinking that we are changing, that we are doing well. But reality is they are not with us. And so looking for that personality that can do these type of changes is important. But the other thing that's important is how we manage people, right? In that entire thinking that we need to make changes. And I was at the Manufacturing Leadership Council conference earlier this year, and we are all talking about the Manufacturing Leadership Council does innovation in manufacturing environments. And it's a peer-to-peer group. We are helping each other with what's actually happening when we try to do innovation and what type of innovation works and those type of things. And still the main problem that everybody is struggling with is exactly what I'm talking about, is that thing about changes. So one example that I think is important can show some of the background that I'm talking about here is purchasing. So when you think about, we have a couple of million purchasing agents sitting throughout companies, and they have their entire career. They were told and rewarded for driving down cost. That was the number one thing, right? Great job. You got the cost down by 3%. Hooray, right? We get into the pandemic and we saw this, right? And all of a sudden that collaboration that many of us started talking about decades ago, saying, okay, collaboration in supplier management is the number one. That just surfaced, right? The other thing that surfaced that was really interesting is, of course, the reliability and the governance, right? How do we manage these suppliers? And so what's happening here is new priorities shifted into this purchasing group. But here we have this purchasing agent who's been sitting for 25 years. And for 25 years, we have rewarded that purchasing agent on driving down cost. Hey, you got this. Let me get you a bonus. Let me give you the company award. Let me get you whatever. And so that's a reward system, right? And rewards are not just monetary, as we know, but it's also what's being recognized. And so I think it takes very deep thinking from any leader to think about, okay, how do we take that willingness to change and the new world and translate that into which actions do we need people to take, and how do we then create the culture and the reward system that enhances that entire environment. And of course, culture, just sidestepping here, culture is about what is permissible, and it's also about what we reward. Rewards can be different things, right? It can be what leaders reward, coming from up in the hierarchy, and it can be what peers reward. It can even be what staff members reward, right? They will reward a certain type of leader by telling everybody how much they love working for that person, or the peers will do kudos and go out with people in the evening. And there are different types of reward system. We need to think very, very deeply about what it is we are rewarding in our culture and what's permissible, right? What's permissible has changed a lot over the last decades, and certainly it's going to change dramatically also over the next many years. There's, of course, the entire tech, data, info, insight. How are we thinking about data? And it's not just the technical aspect, but it's It's how do we deal with them? What's the integrity we have when it comes to data? How do we think about the implied customer or public promise? Right? So each time we interact with somebody, we have an implied promise, meaning we promise something that's understood. Right, we're not necessarily surfacing it in a contract, but we promise that we're going to deal ethically with things and stuff like that. Are we hiring for that? And are we thinking about deeply about how we are going to use data and the overall implications, leading us to the other thing around governance, right? And the entire sustainability and ESG movement. So very important parts of the supply chain ecosystem that we need to build into our understanding and hiring. So that, I think, the other thing we need to think about is the complexity, right? So we have built in a lot of complexity to our supply chains. And that's part of the problems that we saw during the pandemic, that our systems really are not set up to deal with that type of complexity that comes from variability and large amounts of interactions and data. And some of that, of course, comes from regulations. And I don't have a graph of regulations, but I can promise you that regulations are going up all the time. So you take that combination of complexity and regulations, and you really see that it's just growing. It's grown tremendously. And, I mean, you see it when you do a border crossings, you have regulations to get products out, and you have got regulations to get product in. And you've got regulations to transport products. And so now all of a sudden you've got 3 sets of regulations to make one transaction. It's hugely complex. Now, I have all faith that eventually we are going to have really great systems helping us deal with this. And 2030 may be as good a year to think and hope for that this is not going to be as big a deal as it is right now. But right now, reality is that those 2 areas are really huge areas. So to make it to 2030, we need to find a way to deal with this. I've seen companies do it on spreadsheets. I have seen them do their own systems. I've seen a number of different things happening in this, but we need the people who can deal with this type of complexity and regulations and make it simple and workable on an everyday basis. So again, hoping that we are getting systems to deal with it. So far, we've got to have people on our team who can really make it. So the other part of the ecosystem that I think we need to talk about, and that I know you've been talking about over the last couple of days, is the entire staffing ecosystem. And again, when you look at the trend and what's happening and what happened during the pandemic, it was not so surprising. What's surprising, what happened was the speed with which it happened changed. So everybody seems to be waking up every morning saying, is this a job I really want? Is it meaningful to me? And do I want to go to work today? And that question, I think when you look historically, most people didn't ask that. Most people would say, okay, I'm taking a job and I'm staying there for a number of years. And then I'm thinking about another job if something goes haywire in the job, or I don't get my opportunities, or, my spouse is moving to another state. Then sure, I'm quitting, but I'm working at this job. But what happened was we got a new generation in, and that new generation was thinking differently about employment. They wanted, and they asked for many years ago, when I say many years ago, let's call it 5 years ago, it started, that they asked for purpose-driven employment. I think companies that were tone deaf and didn't understand that message really suffered through the pandemic, because they were still living in this world where, of course, you're showing up to work every day and you're giving your best to Well, that was not what their staff members were thinking. Right? Staff members were thinking, "Oh, I've got to go through hoops to go to work, and I've got a lot of other things going on in the background." Right? So during the pandemic, of course, part of what was going on was the schools were closed. Their parents got Alzheimer's but couldn't be admitted to a nursing home. The infrastructure that they relied on to make their lives work with too busy professionals or whatever they were, just it was no longer there. So it got the hoops to go through, it got more difficult. And then there was simply some thinking going on that maybe it's not worth it. And that's why we are seeing that there's not just a numbers crisis, but there's an emotional alignment crisis in what is it we want to how do we look at our staff members versus how do they look at us? So there needs to be alignment around that. And I think the most important thing anybody can do for their staff is make the employment purpose-driven. Now, if you have a bad purpose, then you're probably having a really hard time with this, right? So what we are trying to do here is, of course, make sure that our purpose is reasonably aligned with what the staff members expect. So what does purpose-driven employment do and give? I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, but let's say the sustainability and the governance is an important part of that. I mean, we none of us want to work for companies that are unethical or treat others poorly or are known as big polluters. We want to work for company leaders for world-class leaders in that field. And so looking at just those type of parameters already helps with the purpose-driven. And then, of course, we need to think about how we can take that purpose-driven and make it such that we are actually building something. So there were a number of people talking about mental health crisis, and I understand this has been a big topic that has been discussed at this conference. So I think once you put a purpose, and a purpose that everybody really feels strongly about, into your goals, and it becomes part of the driver for your company, I think it helps everybody mentally, because part of what we want is we want to feel aligned. We want to feel like a team. We want to feel we are making a difference. And that's what purpose-driven employment can give. When we don't feel we are making a difference, or we sit on the fringes, it becomes much more challenging and much more of a health crisis. And then, of course, to think about how diversity, equity, and inclusion figures in, and justice and belonging figure into our staffing ecosystem, right? So there's both where we're recruiting from, and then what do we do when everybody has been recruited, and how do we adapt into the culture, and how do we understand what we are dealing with from diversity? I mean, we are all in some ways diverse, but how do we look at our staffing from that perspective? Anybody who's not looking at diversity and inclusion really has a big problem right now, right? Because the old schools hiring is simply not working. You've got to go out to minorities and groups that traditionally have been marginalized and elevate them. And then, of course, during the pandemic and still, really understand the social environment that people are working in. And I think that's why empathy got to the big driver of business success during the pandemic, that we had this breakdown of social structures and also to some extent of emotional structures. So I mentioned elder care. Elder care actually a much bigger problem than childcare these days. But of course, schools closed, it's a problem for parents. So that's the ecosystem that we are working in. Let me talk a little bit about the purpose-driven culture. So first of all, I think everybody needs to understand where we're going. And they need to feel that the goal we're working on is really important. It needs to align reasonably with employee sentiments. So I'm not suggesting that you go out and you do a poll of how employees feel and this becomes your company goal or your department goal or things like that. I'm saying, okay, don't set a goal that is in one direction, but all your employees feel something else. That's going to create an exodus. It's going to surface that you're probably not aligned, but it's going to create an exodus. So be reasonably sensitive to what's important to your employees in terms of sentiments. Be reasonably sensitive to what's important to them, and don't do anything that's opposite. And if you're thinking about doing something that's opposite, you really need to think very hard about that. So I'm not saying you couldn't do it. So let's say, for instance, one of the things my company does is very much into flexibility, agility, customization, much less into standardization. So we have this dichotomy all the time: do we standardize or do we customize? And it's not necessarily an easy decision, though I go typically and customize. Do we get people in who like to standardize? Yeah, right. But so those type of discussions are worth having. Just take care when you put your goals up that they are not out of alignment. And then you build the culture around that. And I already spoke a little bit about what culture is. The culture really is important for how, and it's fun when I speak with the job applicants about culture and which culture makes them succeed. Many of them talk about what they're wearing, clothes and stuff. And that has got very little to do with anything. What's really important is, again, what's rewarded, what's permissible. So there are things you really cannot do in certain cultures. For instance, in our culture, one of you must deliver. So we're very performance focused, and you cannot be disrespectful towards others. Right? So that's some of the things that you must do, but also that you can get in trouble for doing. And be aware that you can actually do a subculture. So if your overall company has a culture, you can actually do a subculture and you can be deliberate about it. You cannot have a subculture that's very different from your overall culture, but you can make some adjustments to the culture. So since we started talking about this entire talent crisis and how are we going to deal with it and how did we see that? And so one of the things we're doing when we have a new staff member, and actually every 3 months, is we make a one-page business plan. And you actually see here, and no, you cannot read it, our business plan for this quarter. Right, so you see there's a circle. It's got our values, our key values. We've got our 3 to 5 year mission statement and where we're going, what our goals are. We've got our annual goals and we've got our quarterly goals. And they are shared with every single person, from the janitor and the receptionist and all the way to the C-suite. So everybody gets one of these business plans and know what's going on. And then, of course, it's multi-directional. So we have a system set up such that we go get information both to and from everybody. It's not just up and down the hierarchy. It's also same levels. And, of course, it's external. It's a thing we'll talk about in a minute. And then we had the thought about 5-10 years ago, which is, since we could see this talent crisis looming, how can we hire and onboard faster? And one of the tools we're using is ALOM University. We started that 5 years ago, and it creates visibility to what each person needs to know. So there's some institutional knowledge. There's also the things that we normally would tell people. So we had a big issue before that. When we hired a new person, it was sometimes years before they were fully up to speed. And we brought that down significantly, which, I mean, I don't need to tell you how profitable that is, right? You know, we get people who are really, really effective right away. And then we are very conscious about tools and support. It's the number one thing people ask when you give them a new project is, am I going to get the resources and tools to succeed? So I'm always thinking about how can I make somebody more productive, get them to be more successful, and make useful, meaningful information available real time, information that they can react to. And then we keep thinking about, okay, what do we do with that deficit of talent? Well, if we don't have enough talent, how do we deal with this? Number one, we grow our own. So we have had interns since 1999, and fortunately, some of them stay on and become staff members. We do aggressive training. We have support tools. We spend about 3 times as much on training per payroll dollar as the average US company. We also help our staff members with their personal goals. So it's not just the training that we need, but it's also their personal goals and their dreams. So we support them. And because of that, even if they decide now they want to do a career change or anything, it's a two-way street. So the relationship is different. And I get questions about, what do you do about quiet quitting? Well, if you have a different relationship with the employees, you don't get that type of what I would call passive-aggressive behavior. And we spoke about hiring from underserved communities. And then one thing I've learned is don't throw more people at the problem. Right? You're in the middle of the water. Just don't throw more people at the problem. That doesn't always work. One of the hard things that I keep struggling with is we have always believed to go for the best. We are not compromising. We really want the best, highest level talent, and we don't want to settle. And of course, when you are in a talent crisis, it's really hard, right? And so one of the things we're working on with the recruiters all the time is retraining them on what we're looking for. And then in the end, we've got to understand we're dealing with people. So I talked about empathy. I think one of the most important things, the flexibility, the support, and understand that we're not running a prison system. We are running real operation with real people. So it's two-way communication. And I think somebody mentioned before, make it fun. And that has been one of our key things. And it's not just parties and social, but certainly it's about the everyday work and how we can make that meaningful. So let me, as I'm here getting to the end and leaving a little bit of time for questions, talk about collaboration. So collaboration is a new goal. And hiring and managing for collaborative behavior is really important. So the personality traits, certainly very key. So trying to not hire people with big egos, but people who really like to work together and achieve things in a collaborative way. Not just upwards in the organization, not just customer focused, but general. And then thinking about your suppliers. So your suppliers are part of your collaborative ecosystem, and you need to find a way to pull them in. It's not just about who you get on the bus, but it's also how do you treat them once they are on the bus. So you need to think about how you build your organizational structure based on agility, innovation, and big picture thinking. I mean, the small picture thinking we have machines or computers to do. Think about the big picture thinking. How can we encourage that everybody thinks innovatively and steps up and thinks about what's really the end goal? When you do your planning, of course, it's okay to planning for how the organizational structure should be. Of course, it's okay to band-aid every once in a while and get somebody in who can help fill a hole. But in the end, you want to have the end goal in mind and make sure that you're hitting that. So our outcome throughout the pandemic was great. We succeeded in having 73% staffing growth. We had great coherency. We achieved our production goals. But I think it was a lot of preparation going. The other thing that's important, and I think something for everybody to think about, is in the old world, achieving the goals was the only really important thing when you ran an operation. Today, the methodology and how you treat everybody while you're achieving your goals is just as important. So it's a reset seen from a leadership standpoint. So getting to our to the finish line here, we set a goal to be not just the supplier of choice, and everybody's talking about we want our customers to feel we are the supplier of choice, and of course that's super important. We all want our customers to love us, and we are very customer focused. We all would say it's all about the customer. But there are two other things that have come up that's just as important. One is to be the customer of choice. It's to have our suppliers really love working with us and thinking about giving us innovation and attention as the first item that comes off the line that we really need for our production. So being the customer of choice and having that type of relationship. And then, of course, being the employer of choice. So align this talent strategy with the supply chain strategy. Think about how you're hiring, developing, growing, rewarding, create the collaboration and trust, and then develop the culture for success. But I'd say more than that, develop the culture where your team will succeed and reward them when they are succeeding in the manner that you really want. And with that, I will wrap it here, and I have a little bit of time here for questions. So I'll take questions from the audience, and I don't know how this is moderated, but otherwise feel free to put questions in the chat box.